Now we're going to run through all the different tools you might be using with your basic soldering for assistive technology. First is your work mat. This is a basic, nice work mat that I can cut on and not worry about it. If I drop little droplets of solder, no big deal. It's also in a grid pattern here, 1-inch grid. So if I need to kind of roughly measure how things are, that's very easy to do as well. This guy right here, this is called a helping hands, and it is very helpful. Often when you're working, you don't have enough hands to do everything you need to do by yourself. So these little adjustable arms with the alligator clips on the end let you place something where you need it to be, and then you can have your hands free for other things like holding your soldering iron and your solder. Maybe I'm gonna solder these two wires together. I can line up the wires roughly how I need them to be, etc. Very handy. This particular model also happens to have a magnifying glass. Well, it can be helpful. If I'm honest, I don't use that part all that much, occasionally. But yeah, so that's the helping hands. There's a few different models, different types, but this is your basic helping hands. Okay, let's look at the irons themselves. This is your basic soldering iron, 60-watt model here. You know, you can pick one of these up for $15 to $20. I would not ever purchase one less than 60 watts. That's not going to be nearly strong enough. This is temperature adjustable with this little dial here. This one goes from 200 to 450 degrees Celsius. For most of the kind of soldering we will be doing, you're going to want to max that out at about 450. And then you can see it's basic. It plugs straight into an outlet. There's no other units. It does have a nice rubber grip there. And then your tip. So this one has got a basic conical tip on it, which is what you're going to be using for the kind of soldering that we are doing. But those tips are replaceable, whether because it's worn out over time, or if you're doing different type of soldering. You can see each of these replacement tips have different shapes to them. So just so you know, those are options. Now the soldering iron that I use, and if you find that you think you're going to be doing a fair amount of soldering, it's very handy, is called a solder station. So you can see there's this separate power unit that my iron plugs into, on and off, and it will go off automatically after a given amount of time if it's not been touched. And it has a dial here to go from as low as 350 all the way up to 850. Most of the type of work we're doing, we would be staying in the ballpark of about 650. So this is a solder station. Here's your stand for your iron. This wire spiral deal here that holds your iron. I've got a damp sponge here, which is one method you can use for cleaning off your tip. The other method that I prefer is using one of these little copper buckets. You've got inside It's kind of like a little mini garbage can almost. And it's got this ball of copper, kind of reminiscent of something you would find in the kitchen for washing your pots. So that goes in there. And then when you're cleaning your tip, you just kind of dive it in there a few times and it cleans your tip off very nicely. Okay. Next we have the solder itself. I've got a large spool of it here. This is a multi-core lead solder with flux. A lot of the time I will just hold this in my hand, but you absolutely can just cut off a length of it. That might be easier. You wrap it around your finger while you're working, etc. Another way you might see solder is something like this. So it's inside this tube and you kind of just pull it out as you need it. A couple more basic tools that might come with your soldering iron, your soldering station is this is basically like a pencil shaped tool with a magnet on the end. So you drop something small you're working with, you can pick it up real easily. And then tweezers. These are bent nose tweezers, they're straight tweezers. Very handy again for getting in close and tight spots. Similarly, we've got needle nose pliers. Use your basic needle nose pliers, little spring action, a little easier to manipulate. There is a cutting surface in the bottom. You can use it also as wire cutters. These ones, a longer nose, sometimes those are very useful. It might be harder to get a real solid grip right on the end sometimes with a longer needle nose, but they generally work pretty well. Your wire strippers, again with a spring action, and you'll see the notches are labeled 10 to 22 for the different sizes or gauges of wire. So when you're stripping away the plastic shielding on around your wires, this is the tool you would go to make that happen. Your blades, these constantly being used to trim or cut something. Both sizes can be handy, frankly. Standard wire cutters. This is a desoldering pump or solder sucker. Sometimes you need to remove solder from your project because there's too much. Maybe you have a crossover between 2 points giving you a short, or it's just ugly, or you had a cold solder and you need to redo it. So you apply heat from your iron onto the solder you want to remove to heat it up again. You depress the plunger there and you get the tip right on top of that solder you want to remove and hit the button and it sucks it right up into here. And then you push the plunger down again and it dumps out the old solder. So again, you heat it up. In fact, I'm going to demonstrate that right now. So, put a little pile of solder on here. There we go. Oops, I don't want that solder there. So we'll wait for that to cool. Okay, I want to get rid of that. So I've got my solder sucker. Press the plunger so it's ready to go. I'm adding heat again to the solder so it's liquid, and I suck it up. and it's gone. Works pretty easily. So now again, if I press the plunger, that old solder will get shoved out. Works pretty efficiently. A second way you can use to get rid of solder is this desoldering braid. It's copper wire braided together, and the idea is you place the braid over on top of the solder that you want to get rid of, and you apply heat to the top of the braid, and then that solder should suck right up into the braid and be removed. I prefer this method most of the time, but once in a while you'll need the braid to really get in there and get it out. Okay, another tool, sort of a tool that you're going to need often, is called shrink tubing. This tubing that comes in different diameters is used once you have performed your soldering and you have your wires connected. You need to protect those exposed wires, and so a little bit of shrink tubing can help you do that. So imagine I put my shrink tubing on before I solder, right? And then I solder these together and it's connected, but now there's that open spot. So you slide the shrink tubing over the connection, and then you apply heat with your lighter, and this tubing shrinks right up and will grab onto there and hold it and have it sealed nicely. That's the purpose of shrink tubing and your lighter. All right, just a couple more things. Sometimes good old glue gun is going to be useful. The glue is non-conductive, so that can be helpful to help keep wires from crossing over. However, if you do use the glue, you ever want to go back in and try to repair or redo some piece of work, that glue is going to make it next to impossible to accomplish that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. All right, those are most of the tools that you would need to do toy adaptation and switch repair. One other tool that's very effective is a tester box for your switches or whatever it is you're switch adapting. That just lets you plug an item in such as a switch and then test it, and you will get a sound to let you know if it's working correctly. All right.